the second time in this war, and to another 120,000 of them comes the great adventure. So it's goodbye to the cities and danger areas, labelled and loaded and not forgetting their gas masks. The children head for the special trains, and they're not worrying, they're off on a holiday.
What is it like being in the countryside? Because obviously in those days you lived in the city and you wouldn't have gone that far, so to be in the countryside was a massive thing.
It's difficult to put an adult interpretation to what it was like at 7 years old, but I'll try. You have to imagine going on a journey and being quite excited, going on the steam train. And then the next memory is, I think, with my mother and my sister knocking on doors, one after another. Will you take in a boy and a girl, this boy and a girl? And the people inside each time said, we'll have the girl but not the boy. Yes. Until we finally came to a house and the woman took the two of us in and my mother disappeared, went off. Next morning I woke up in a strange house, didn't know where I was, where the toilet was. So I found my clothes and went downstairs, and there was a woman in the kitchen and she gave me my breakfast, and I said, what do I do now? She said, you go out to play. So I walked out of the house, down a little hill, turned right, up a lane, and climbed over a 5-bar gate and walked halfway up the hill, the field, turned round, and I'd never been more scared in all my life. I was 7, and the sky and the land went on forever, and just me. Absolutely terrified, but nothing happened to me, so I continued on my journey across the field and came to a stile, climbed the stile and into a little lane, and the whole lane was singing. The telegraph wires were all humming and singing. I crossed over and walked down the side of a hedge till I came to the top of the hill and a forest going down on the other side of the hill. In that corner, every hedge underneath had the yellow flowers growing as far as the eye could see. Gosh, I can't think what they're called now. So it must have been springtime, but it was absolutely beautiful. Anyway, I carried down beside the forest, down the lane, and came out to the bottom of the valley with a stream, and in front of me a farmyard and a house, and stood looking at the farmyard gates, and the farmer came out, and I was dressed in a yellow southwester jacket and hat, and the farmer said, "Don't let the cows see you in that," he said, "and they might think you're a turnip." And then he relented, and I told him that came from London, and he said I could play in the barn. and I went into the barn, and there was a little stairway up one part of it with a hay loft. And when I got to the top, the strangest noise in the world. And I looked down through a hole, and there was a wrought iron or an iron grill on the side with hay in it, 2 big ears and 2 brown eyes, and I was looking down on 2 horses. So within one day I'd made 2 friends, a farmer and 2 horses, or 3 friends.
Didn't you have a story about the priest reacting to you? Because obviously he wouldn't have known many people from London.
Oh, right. Well, on the first Sunday of being evacuated, 2 people knocked at the door, came to the house, and took me across the fields to the Catholic Church in Cullompton. Yes. I was in Bradninch, near Exeter, Devon, and 2.8 miles across the field to the Catholic Church in Cullompton. Beside the church was a little annex and a door, and I was just ushered in there, and then that was the last I ever saw of the people. But inside was a little screen, and I thought, well, it must be for confession. So I kneeled down on the little kneeler and said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And the voice round the back said, "What the hell?" Because if you imagine in those days, a little boy from London in Devon would have been like E.T.
Also, you probably had. Did you have a strong London accent?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Got my accent in Devonshire. So I went to communion in the church, and that was the last time ever across the fields. So I went to the woman took me to the Baptist church in Devon, and the first Sunday I went there, I had to read the lessons. So I stood in the pulpit at 7 and read the Beatitudes. And after that, all hell must have broke loose, because a Catholic boy in a Baptist church, and the Catholics probably in Bradninch were up in arms. So at the school I was removed from RE classes and had to sit in the corridor and do the catechism. You know? So I became really good at the catechism. It was a question and answer, little moral booklet, which Churchill described as the best twopence worth ever printed. So my life became Sunday school, the Baptist church. In the afternoon I joined the Salvation Army with the band and carried the big the bass drummer's seat round for him. So very religious upbringing. A year and a half after being evacuated, I came from school, and a woman jumped out. When we came in through the kitchen, a woman jumped out on us, and I thought, who is this woman that's been so over the top? And it was my mother, and we'd forgotten her.
Because you've been away so long.
Yeah. Well, within a moment, it's a different environment, different people, totally different life in one moment. I tell you what, I'll tell you a story. Towards the end of the war, so we're talking about 1945, at 13, I read the Wizard comic, and each comic I carefully put one on top of the other, so I had a pristine pile, absolutely clean. And the comic had, my hero was Wilson of the Wizard. Towards the end of the war, then 1945, my parents made the big move from Station Road, Leighton, to Wanstead. And so they'd survived, got through the war, making the big move, new house, etc. Josie and I,
Which is your sister?
were sent to be out of the way while the move was on. So we were sent onto my uncle's and aunt's chicken farm in Suffolk, Bentley, Suffolk. What started as a small period there went on to about 6 months, but we didn't ever question why. Now, after the 6 months, my brother came down and he had grown about 6 inches in about 6 months. And he sat my sister Josie and I we went into the forest and sat on a tree stump, and he told us that within a fortnight of moving from Leighton to Wanstead, the house was totally smashed down by a V2 rocket. If Josie and I had been in the house, we wouldn't have made it down to the cellar underneath. Philip, Mum and Dad managed to get down the cellar with Tony as the rocket fell and totally demolished the house, which imploded. So Mum, Dad, Philip, with Tony across him, were buried alive. So Phil came down to tell us about this, and basically it was too much for young people to understand. And I said to Philip, having been told this story, did you find my wizards? So my brother was lying across Philip, but he had died. Yeah. And my parents were both injured, so we obviously stayed down on the farm for a long time while they recovered. But pretty horrendous to survive the war and then catch a rocket right at the end.
Was that right at the end of the war?
Yeah. August, I think, August 45. writers of that story. When I finally came home, my brother said, "I'll take you down and show you the house, Paul." And the house was totally demolished, but the garden at the back was absolutely superb. It hadn't been touched at all. But outside the rubble on the pavement was a car with a door open, and a man walking across the rubble and pinching all the garden plants, and loading up his car. And we stood over him, and he said, "Yes, what do you want?" He said, "We live here. Put them back." We made him replant all the flowers. And I've never seen anybody look more scared in his life. My brother could have killed him. But at 13, it was an impossible story to take in. You just couldn't understand it. So that's why I asked, had he found my wizards? Sorry, what was that question?
You went back to Devon last year, didn't you? What was it like?
Yeah. I went back to all the places that I've just said and absolutely cried my eyes out. And it was difficult to think why, but I was crying for my youth. Yeah. So evacuated actually for 5 years. Was home a couple of times, changing schools, but other than that, 5 years away. When I finally got a bag, I had to go to St Ignatius College, but there were so few pupils at the end of the war that there was no kitchen staff. So we had to go out to a hall nearby and get sort of Meals on Wheels. And the Meals on Wheels came in, I think they were aluminium trays, and everything was cut into squares. So this particular day with my friends at the end of the table, we each got a square of custard. If you push the custard, it turned into a rhomboid shape and then sprang back again. So my friend said, "Go on, Paul, see if it bounces." So I lifted up my custard. Not only did it not bounce, but it sprayed everybody at the end of the table with custard. And we went off laughing, and I thought no more about it. But a fortnight later, I got a call over it wasn't the tannoy in the school, that Paul Lane had to report to the headmaster's office. And there, at the back of his office, were my parents sitting. I was standing on the carpet, and then the headmaster said, "I understand that Verlaine, you started a custard fight, and we're considering that you should be expelled." It's not the sort of thing to do, but I understand that your parents have said that for 5 years you've been evacuated without any parental control. So we're going to give you a trial, and you can write letters of apology to the kitchen staff. So my school career nearly started with being expelled. But years and years later, I went back and I stood on the same piece of carpet in front of the staying headmaster and got a job. And I was in the office about 2 minutes, and he said, "Let's talk it over, Paul, over dinner." And we went for dinner, and he looked at the timetable and he said, "I hope there's no custard." So, so it was quite a good end to the story.
Yeah. Anything else?
But there are rider stories too. Evacuation. It's a little bit difficult to describe. The last time I came back for the Forever, on the following Saturday, my dad said, "I'm going fishing at the Hollow Ponds," and I said, "Could I come?" So he got out an extra rod and we went down to the Hollow Ponds. And he set me up to fish and then moved down a few yards away, and he just didn't fish at all. He just stood looking at me fishing, because a 7-year-old boy had gone away and a 13-year-old son was, he just stood looking at me. Right, you'll have to ask me some questions if you... Sorry?
You talked for 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Good God. Didn't try and analyse it, that's what I would have thought. That's what everybody did. You had to leave home.
So what are your memories of South Africa like?
Oh, I have quite a few memories of South Africa. I think my earliest memory really is when my mother went into hospital to have my sister, and that must have been in 1942. And my father decided that he would stay at home and look after me, although I did have a nanny, but he decided that he would do the job. And the one thing I really do remember is one night he decided to get me ready for bed. So I had my bath, and then he was helping me into my pyjamas, and I don't know quite what went wrong, but we somehow managed to put my two legs into one trouser leg, and of course we collapsed laughing, and that really did stick in my brain. And then after that, obviously my father decided that that was enough, and I was palmed off to some friends who had two, obviously must have been teenage boys. One was called Ronnie, and I can't remember the name of the other boy. And we went to stay in their house, and when I was dropped off, I can't remember the name of the lady of the house. She was very, very sweet to me. And I remember her saying to Ronnie, take Jilly and take her for a walk around the garden, and don't forget to hold her little hand so she doesn't fall over." And that phrase stuck in my memory, because it was probably 18 months later, perhaps 2 years later, at our house, which was a bungalow, and it had steps leading up to it with a big veranda, and we had quite a big lawn, and my nanny, called Annie, had a daughter who had a baby, and Annie brought the baby to work one day, and she was such a dear little soul. And I can remember saying to Annie, because they put the baby to sit on a rug on the lawn, and I was there beside her, and I said, "May I hold her little hand?" And that sort of rung a bell. And I obviously sat there and held her little hand and talked to her. And that's one of the things I remember. And another thing I remember was, say, my mother had the baby, And my father said, come on, we're going to see Mummy in hospital. And I was really quite excited. And we got to the hospital and we went up in a big lift. And we went into this room and it was all white. And I thought it smelt peculiar. And obviously I was lifted up to the bed and I gave my mum a kiss. And she said to me, don't you want to see the baby? And I wasn't really bothered about seeing the baby. Anyway, Father lifted me up to look into the cot. And I saw this little thing lying there. Wasn't particularly interested in it. And then I spied in the corner of the room a white enamel bucket. And it looked really funny to me, so when I was put down I walked over to it to have a look, and I lifted the lid up and of course it was a dirty nappy bucket. But what fascinated me was that knob on top of the lid had little holes round it, obviously ventilation holes. And my mother said, I can remember to this day saying, Gillian, get away from that nappy bucket right now. And I wondered what I'd done wrong. So that was one of the things I remembered, was when my mother had my sister Veronica. Right. Well, after Christmas, having spent with all my cousins, which I thoroughly enjoyed, in the new year we went up to stay with my grandfather in Abu Dhabi, North Wales, and no sooner had we got up there than it started to snow. And of course we had never seen snow, so it was just wonderful. We couldn't wait to get out and play in the snow. And of course once we got out in the snow we got cold and we had to come in again.
Were you scared of, were you a bit anxious of what snow was? Because you never...
No, we'd seen pictures of snow, and I think I'd seen it in comics that we had. But the one thing I remembered about being at my grandfather's house was that he was getting quite old he was well in his 80s, and he used to take some stuff called cod liver oil of malt. And he had it in a jar and you put your spoon in and took it out, and he had that every day. I presume it was a form of tonic for him. And then one day I heard a big row coming from the kitchen, and my mother was absolutely furious with him because he'd finished his jar of malt, but obviously there was still some inside, and he'd put it outside in the garden on a wall, and a robin had gone in and got stuck. His little feet had got stuck in it, so my mother had to get him out.
Wow.
I presume she must have done eventually.
So like you were saying, you were 10 months old when you left England, and obviously coming back you had no memories of it, and it was quite a very different experience coming to England.
Totally different experience to being in England from being in South Africa, where it was lovely and warm. And of course we had rain, we had hail out there, I remember once, and we had wonderful thunder and lightning storms. Another thing I remember about being in South Africa was I had typhoid fever, which I was rushed into hospital, and of course I was isolated for quite a few days, weeks I should imagine, probably months in the end. And I'd gone in with my little doll, and awful thing, it was called Wetums, because it had a little bottle that I filled with water, and I could feed it the water, and it used to come out the other end on its nappy, and I presume that's why I called it Wetums. But unfortunately I'd taken it into hospital with me, and it was put in a steriliser, and it was made, the whole doll's body and head was made of compressed sawdust, And so, of course, it all fell to bits.
Oh.
So I lost my doll, so I was a bit upset about that. And the other thing that upset me about being in the hospital was that I was isolated. And none of the children, it was in a big children's ward, and there was a big veranda which ran past my room, and the children used to try and come in and see me, and they were taken away. And that upset me because I had no contact. And then one day, I was obviously over it, I was moved into the main ward, and I had a little bed right at the end of the ward. And this one particular day, it was exciting because the parents were all coming in to see us, and I could see my mother at the door, and she gave me a wave, and she started to walk towards me, and I got up, and of course I'd been in bed for so long, my muscles had all shrunk, and I fell flat on my face.
Wow.
So that wasn't a very nice experience. And I remember having to being trained to walk again. And then when I got home to our house, I've got a photograph somewhere of me when I just started to walk, and I was so proud of myself that I could actually walk. And then, of course, a week or so later, I was running again and enjoying myself. But I just have happy memories of South Africa. Excuse me.
Do you feel like you have a lot of happy memories because it was a lot of your childhood? Or
Happy memories for what?
you have a lot of happy memories of South Africa because obviously it took place a lot in your childhood. And
Oh yes, very happy memories, yes, because I was, 7 when we came home to England. I remember starting school when I was 6, because you started later out there. And I'm still in contact with my first teacher that I had in South Africa.
wow.
And she kept in contact with my mother. And then, of course, I've kept it, after my mother died, I kept in contact with her. And she has actually moved to Ireland. I haven't seen her, though. If ever we go to Ireland, I shall try and look her up, because I did like her.
You said England, the first time you saw it was very grey and very dull. Was that sort of the opposite to South Africa in a way? Was South Africa very exciting?
Well, I think South Africa was it was sunny, so everything was bright. Whereas when you came home to England, everything seemed to be grey. It was don't forget, it was December, so the days were probably grey and overcast.
And obviously people were recovering from the Blitz and stuff.
They were, yes, and everyone was drab because they were on rationing for clothes. And then after we left North Wales and came back down to London to live with my auntie Lily, and then eventually my dad came back from South Africa as well, and he was stationed at a place called Pathe, just outside Southampton, because he worked on flying boats. And he bought a house in Southampton, in Waterloo Road. I remember that. And we moved there. And my school was at the end of the road, so it wasn't too far to walk.
Obviously being in South Africa, were you quite separated from the war and what was going on? Because compared to other people who were evacuated, you were probably quite separate from everything.
Oh yes. And of course I was able to speak 2 or 3 different languages, because of course my nanny used to talk to me in Zulu, and then another one of the girls who worked in the house spoke, I presume, Swahili, so I had a few words of that. And then our gardener was an Indian, and so I presume he spoke, I'm trying to think what language he might have spoken. But I remember I used to have to translate for my mum to him. She would say, "Tell him I want him to do so and so." And then I'd say to her, "He says he can't do it." But I can't remember a word of any of the languages now.
It was a while ago, so if you haven't practiced it, that's understandable.
Mm-hmm. Well, you think it was 72 years ago.
Yeah. Have you ever been back to South Africa?
No. My parents went back several times because with my father working for BOAC, as it was then, they used to get cheap flights.
Would it be something you would want to do? Or?
I wouldn't mind going. I think it would be rather nice if I had lots of money. I could go back. I'm sure it's all altered terribly now. The school wasn't that far away from where we lived, and several of our neighbours who lived around about the children, we all used to meet down the road and then all walk off to the school together.
Would South Africa have been more mixed than London would have been? So it was.
You mean mixed races? Yes, but don't forget in those days it was very much an Afrikaans country.
Yeah.
And I was just beginning to learn Afrikaans when I went to school because all the lessons would be in Afrikaans. But to begin with they were in English, and then we would gradually, Afrikaans would take over. And of course black people were really just treated as servants. But I do remember coming home from school, it was hot, and I remember we used to take our shoes off, or sandals, and carry them home. My mother was absolutely furious, and I can remember her saying, "You'll have feet like a native." Well, she probably said something more rude than that, but...
Yeah.
Even now I like walking around without shoes on. I mean, obviously out there we used to do that.
So,
I've just remembered one other horrible thing. I think it's probably why I'm absolutely terrified of rats. Only my mother decided that there was something in the roof of our house. And I remember my father and the gardener and another chap went up and they set traps because they said there were rats up there. And I remember them bringing these traps down with these huge great rats in them. Ooh! And even then it made me terrified, and I still am to these days. I mean, there were dead things in a trap, but why it upset me, I just don't know.
wow. So were they bigger than normal rats usually?
I don't know. They just seemed huge to me at the time.
Yeah.
I was probably, 5 or 6?
Had you already experienced them before?
No. And yet I had a white mouse while I was out there. And I'm still frightened of mice even now. And yet I had this little white mouse in its cage. And I used to handle it. And yet I still don't like them now. Can't bear the thought of those little feet. Ooh, and those long tails. I do remember once, it was when I came out of hospital having had typhoid fever, I had a little bed in my parents' bedroom because I was a bit frightened on my own in my bedroom, and then all of a sudden I decided that was it. And my mother decided that I was a big girl now and I could go into my own bedroom, which I was put in my own bed. And the first night I was actually in this bed, we had burglars, and they got in through my bedroom window with a little fan light. And I just remember when the police came, and I remember them saying, well, yes, they've got in through your daughter's bedroom fan light. And they said what would happen is that they would hold a child up, probably 8, 9 or 10, drop him down through the fan light, and then he'd run to the front door and open it.
Wow.
And all they took money. And my father evidently used to, at night, take his watch off and take his wallet out of his, and put it on a bedside table, and all that went. And can you imagine, after that, I didn't want to go back into my bedroom because I'd heard what the police had said about getting in through my bedroom. So it took months after that for me to go back into my bed again. How inconvenient it must have been.
That was quite unfortunate.
Yes. Don't really remember a lot more.
It's okay, that's 15 minutes.
Oh, good heavens. Oops. Well, I can go and have my coffee now, can't I?
Yeah.
And then you can grill Grandpa.
Quoting an American newspaper, the indiscriminate orgy of destruction is not the weapon to defeat England. From the dust of London arises only new life and hotter defiance. Hardened and angry, Britain fights back. We've got an adapted slogan now. Can we take it? Sure we can take it, right back where it came from.